Glad to be back with you. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're looking at the comparison between Romans 5 through 8 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. These parallels are absolutely perfect. Paul is obviously discussing resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Likewise, Paul in Romans 5 to 8 discusses resurrection. Both passages are dealing with the Adamic death and the solution to that. In 1 Corinthians 15:56, as I've been sharing with you, Paul said that the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be overcome. Thus, what is it? When you deal with sin, you've dealt with death. All right. Well, we're examining then Romans chapter 8 to show that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about putting on the mortal, or putting off the mortal. He talks about putting off corruption. And we're looking at Paul's discussion of body in 1 Corinthians 15 as it relates to mortality, corruption, and body in Romans chapter 8. Because a comparison of these two texts shows that Romans chapter 8 is absolutely not concerned with biological bodies being raised out of the ground. Now, since Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 15 are parallel in their predictions of resurrection, and since Romans chapter 8 cannot be speaking of biological bodies coming out of the dirt, then that means that 1 Corinthians 15 is not talking about biological bodies coming out of dirt. Okay, now watch this. I've already shared with you how Paul talks about condemnation under Torah, about living in a body of death. But he says now, there is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ, who do not walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Now, Paul is going to talk about flesh and spirit. Well, what does he mean? Well, this is flesh, right? And spirit is the eternal part of us, within us, is what we have always been taught, right? That's not Paul's doctrine. Now watch this. I'm going to begin reading here with verse 4. Well, I'll look at verse 3. What the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Well, now wait a minute. If flesh is this, and spirit is not this, how could Paul say we do not walk according to the flesh? We are all in a physical body of flesh. But that's not Paul's theology. If you walk in the flesh, you are walking in a way, in a lifestyle that is contrary to the will of God. He even says in the very next verse, those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. Do you see he's talking about a mindset when he talks about flesh versus spirit? Whether or not a person is unrighteous, walking according to the flesh, or righteous, living according to the Spirit, they are in a physical body of flesh. But for Paul, living in a biological body of flesh does not identify who we are. It does not identify our standing before God or determine it. Paul is saying what determines our standing, what determines our identity is how we live. according to the flesh, not minding the things of God, rejecting the things of God, or living according to the Spirit, which means living a life in submission and obedience to the will, to the heart, and to the mind of God. That's what determines whether we are living in a body of death or a body of life. Now remember, Paul, as he said, living under Torah, guilty of sin, condemned, said he was in a body of death. Look, if Paul is discussing biological life and death here, every one of us are in a body of death. It's inescapable. And so when people want to deny the reality of spiritual life or spiritual death, they're flying in the face of Paul's discussion of flesh versus spirit. To live according to the flesh, whether or not you have a physical body of flesh. But if you're living according to the flesh, you're living in a body of death. If you're living a life, and you're in a physical body of flesh, but if you're living a life of the Spirit, you are in a body of life. That's Paul's doctrine of flesh versus spirit. And that means that when Paul, as he goes ahead to talk about the body in Romans chapter 8, all of this is directly related to 1 Corinthians 15. That the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be finally overcome. Well, in Romans chapter 8, Paul is saying, if you live your life according to the Spirit, you have what? Life. And yet they were waiting for the consummation of that which had begun, which we saw in Romans chapter 8. They had been buried with Christ by baptism into his death, raised to walk in a subjunctive sense, in anticipation of being like him in his resurrection. So a process of death, burial, and resurrection had begun. They have come into Christ, where Paul says there is no condemnation. But they were looking for the redemption of the body at the coming of the Lord. But you see, once again, the body that Paul's talking about is not the biological body. It's the body standing in relationship to God in a body of death or a body of life. And we've definitely got more, because we're going to see that there is absolutely no way Paul is talking about the raising of biological bodies or the redemption of biological bodies from the dirt. Okay, on the flip side, we're going to see where Paul says those who are in the flesh cannot be pleasing to God. Well, wait a minute. I'm in the flesh, right? You're in the flesh, right? Well, we can't please God then. But that's not what Paul is saying. So we will see you on the flip side.